Skrillex.
Skrillex.
Skrillex. Skrillex.
Skrillex.
Skrillex.
Why is Skrillex so popular? And I don't mean that rhetorically, I mean literally. Which characteristic makes Skrillex Skrillex? When he popularized American dubstep with Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites in 2010, what was the secret ingredient that set him apart from everything else going on in that era? Did he have more technical knowledge than any other artist at that time? Was he naturally more gifted as a songwriter? Or could he possibly, plausibly have been from the future?
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here.
Of course not, but it is fun to think about, like what if you, as a moderately skilled producer, could go back to 2009 knowing what we know now about the electronic music landscape from 2010 to now. The EDM scene is thriving with underground producers who could reasonably recreate every trend that happened in that time span. You could invent Brostep in 2010, then pivot to trap and do the Harlem Shake in 2013, then shift to more melodic stuff and bring future bass back from the actual future. It wouldn't even be that difficult because you'd have the advantage of being the shitty first. Sure, your Brostep might not sound like Skrillex's, but they wouldn't be comparing yours to his, they'd be comparing his to yours. You'd be the visionary, the creator, the innovator, the one who took the initiative to push the boundaries of what's possible. People's minds would be blown when you put trap horns over an 808.
This sounds like a Diplo song!
They'd flip their wigs when you put bland EDM vocal hooks over a stack of tinny super saws. You could even rinse and repeat this process with every music trend that happened from then till the present day. And then I guess technically you'd be at the same exact spot that we're in right now. So now I want to revisit my original question. Why is Skrillex Skrillex? As far as technical know-how, at the time Skrillex made Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites, he was kind of just emulating what drum and bass artists like Noisia had been doing in Europe for a while. And his songwriting talent is pretty high, but I would argue there are many other lesser celebrated acts that are up there on his level. So in my opinion, that only leaves one plausible option for his success. The most valuable asset that Skrillex or any other producer has ever had is their ability to innovate. It's incredibly difficult for a newer producer to do because in the beginning, almost everybody starts out just trying to sound like their favorite artist. And that's completely okay. There's no better way to learn than by having an end result that you know you're aiming for. Like imagine if you were trying to create an invention without knowing what problem you were trying to solve. You'd probably end up just screwing around forever. But what I think plagues the more intermediate or advanced producer is endlessly copying the latest trend but never pushing out towards a new one. So now the big question is, how does one innovate? And this is where I want to pitch you my 5-hour, $500 non-refundable web seminar where I, a random dude off the internet, teach you, another random dude off the internet, how to be the next Skrillex despite not having any accolades of my own. But in all seriousness, from this point forward, I'm going to be speaking 50% from experience and 50% from theories I have, so take the rest of this with a grain of salt. So I want to start things out by talking about a couple different concepts that I think are useful when you're trying to consider innovation. The first of which being macro versus micro innovation. So macro innovation would be broad stylistic decisions intended to deviate from the established conventions of a genre or subgenre, whereas micro innovation would be specific personal techniques aimed towards discovering new sounds, creating new aesthetics, or building new tools. So you can kind of think of the macro as considering the whole genre ecosystem and where and how you might be able to get innovation into it. The macro would be holistic and not just focused on what you're doing, but also what other people are doing around you. So before we explore innovating on a macro level, I want to talk for a second about the genre ecosystem. So you've probably seen diagrams like these two before, tracing the different relationships and roots of genres and subgenres. But these are usually made well after a genre has been solidly established. If you're trying to think about the genre ecosystem in real time, there's going to be a lot more chaos and a lot less easily categorizable, distinct sectioning. I think it's a lot more realistic to think of genres as a fractal pattern. Typically, music doesn't end up being easily categorized into one genre. Often a song can have roots in many different genres, and subgenres can have leading edges that sway towards one side or another of their influences. I think the messy and amorphous properties that fractals tend to have are a much better representation of how songs relate to genres and genres relate to each other. So if you were mapping genres onto a Mandelbrot fractal like this, you might end up with music at the very top and dubstep at the very bottom. And then when you zoomed in, you would see dubstep at the top and minatory at the bottom. And due to the infinite and recursive property of fractals, If you trace them down far enough, you'll eventually get to your song or your sound in your song. So using this concept, let me talk about a few ways that I think you can innovate on a macro level. So how do you engineer a breakthrough? Let's say the year's 2016 and you're an Australian dubstep producer with an affinity for heavy metal. And currently the formula for heavier dubstep is robotic growls and machine gun bass like this.
Yeah, fam, fuck off!
So you decide to make a distinct, recognizable change to that formula by adding a new type of sound, the sustained tear-out bass. You start out with something like this in 2016. Then refine it a bit.
Come with a tune.
Then finally end up releasing this in 2018. So if we take a look at what Murata did here, instead of just trying to make a better machine gun bass or a better robotic growl, he pioneered out in a new direction and added a new element to the subgenre. Then when he saw the positive response to his innovation, he kept refining and improving on it. Many artists have made a niche for themselves by finding a middle ground between two different genres. So for example, Seven Lions took trance and dubstep and combined them to create this. And Sullivan King took metal and dubstep and created this.
I don't care, I don't care, I don't care that I'm dangerous, yeah!
And Casbo took elements of downtempo, chill out, and dubstep to create this. One of the best things about this technique is you don't need to be at the forefront of any of the genres you're taking inspiration from, because you're pioneering a new fractal node for yourself and others to take root in and spread out from. Another thing worth trying is giving an aesthetic overhaul to an established genre or subgenre. So for example, Mr. Carmack took trap music with a party vibe,
Do the Harlem Shake,
and gave it a chillin' with your homies in the basement at 3 a.m. vibe. And Subtronics took heavy dubstep for party bros.
I started blasting, bang!
And gave it a trippy dubstep to blast dabs to Reskin. I think the most important thing here is trying to take what you find cool and integrating that into a genre, with a heavier focus on the aesthetic of that thing and a secondary focus on the genre you're working it into. You don't always have to look outside a genre for a source of innovation. If you take elements of a genre and alter them to create a new focal point, that shift in focus can spawn new expansion points in the genre space. For example, Sudden Death took dubstep, which had often relied on messy, complex, and contrasting rhythms, and simplified the flows. Which allowed for the mixing of multiple bass lines and a heavier focus on contrasting sound design. Or directly after that simplified rhythmic phase of dubstep, Phonon focused in the exact opposite direction. I think the key takeaway here is once a genre is starting to get stale, you can kind of just go in the opposite direction with the same elements to find a new result. If you're fairly well versed in producing, it may be better to ignore genre conventions altogether. You might find solid results by bringing together all the different techniques and songwriting styles that you personally enjoy. I think Leroy's Dariacore albums are a great example of how this might sound. You don't necessarily need to bring together different genres for this type of innovation. If you're a sound designer, you could focus on that over genre, or if you have a keen eye for tone, you might focus your attention on it. The main idea here is placing what you personally know how to do ahead of whatever genre you're trying to fit into. Thinking about macro innovation in the genre space is fun and useful if you have a solid understanding of music production, but it can also be lofty and impractical. Trying to engineer a breakthrough or invent a new genre is easy to say and harder to do. It would be like trying to build your IKEA desk using the picture on the front of the box. And when you're working on a part of a piece of a sound in a section of a drop in a song off an EP in a subgenre of a genre, often you aren't thinking about the genre space or innovation. Oftentimes innovation comes specifically because you're ignoring genre or where your music fits into it. How do you enter the murky waters of what's never been done before musically? I don't mean doing a glitchy industrial color-based track, I mean venturing outside the genre space and not looking to it for guidance. In the first section, I briefly mentioned micro-innovation. The definition I gave was specific techniques aimed towards discovering new sounds, creating new aesthetics, or building new tools. So where macro-innovation places focus on what's happening around your music, micro-innovation looks at your personal skill set and workflow and how you can modify it to build towards innovation. Treat these next few examples I'm about to give as a jumping off point for you to personalize for your workflow. Try doing things you aren't supposed to. It could be breaking personal rules like never using this knob or downloading samples you wouldn't normally, or it might be breaking general production rules like putting reverb on the low end, putting a flanger on the master, or overfilling the low mids in your mix. You could use plugins you never use, especially if you find them unnecessary or useless. You don't need to spend money to do this either. Everyone has plugins they own but never open. You'll probably get the most unique results by picking tools that are in a separate space from what you currently use and understand. You probably won't be able to explore that much if you just try using a different reverb or compressor. Also, there are plenty of tools like Patcher, Snap Heap, Reactor Blocks, and Max for Live where you can build custom tools for yourself to use. You could find new and interesting results by producing with your stream of consciousness. Just start producing, and once the ball's rolling, don't hesitate and make the next part as soon as it comes to mind. If your thinking slows down, just start turning knobs and adding sounds. Don't judge what you're creating and just make it. Don't plan, don't aim, just shoot. You can always go back and refine the best ideas later. Instead of trying to make the best idea or the most uninhibited idea, try to make the most terrible version of your art. That doesn't mean it needs to sound bad, just be heavy-handed at every step of the process. Intentionally do things the wrong way or intentionally do the wrong things. For example, if one of your sounds is distorted, don't turn the distortion down, just distort the rest of the mix around it. If your song needs a breakdown, be lazy and make a stutter edit version of your drop instead of writing new parts. When you produce, you probably follow a set of patterns or sequences. So when I do songwriting, I typically sound design, then process, then compose. Or when it comes to focal point, I usually go melodies first, drums second, fills third, and structure and tension last. Or my processing chain typically goes EQ, compression, reverb, saturation. So I might try starting with a different step, or completely jumbling the order. I could start processing my sound before I finish working on the input. Or I could treat the most important thing as the least. Try doing a set of steps, then repeating that same set of steps again. You could chop and screw your melody 5 times, or resample and reprocess your sound again, or distort your sound, filter it, modulate it, then distort it again, filter it again, and modulate it again. But always feel free to break from or alter your pattern whenever it feels right. Take an idea past its point of pleasantness or do a thing as minimally as possible. Make a thing too glitchy. Don't spend enough time on it. Make it too wet or dry or bassy. Let it be overly simplistic or too repetitive. The ambience from our location often has a big impact on what we make. It's easy to spend long hours in my room working on different stuff, and that singular setting can be both rewarding and stifling. I might try starting a track by recording Foley or melodies, or by whistling into my phone somewhere other than my desk. Or if you have a laptop, pull up to a new spot and see how that affects your process. And I'm not talking about sitting at a Starbucks. Pull up a lawn chair behind an abandoned Kmart and make a beat with your AirPods. You could also build yourself a digital space inside your DAW, like setting up a few different templates full of weird samples and instruments. Treat the song as a subtractive endeavor instead of an additive one. Basically, figure out what you've been doing and try and do something else. It doesn't have to be completely novel, and you don't need to never produce the same way again. The idea is to do a new thing, then use all your old tricks and knowledge to make that thing useful and interesting. It's easy to think skill or ability or knowledge is what makes a good artist, but in my opinion, innovation is more valuable and more rewarded than any other single tool in an artist's tool belt. Anyone can master the craft, it just takes time. But in that time is a trap. The repetition and grinding that it takes to make a few good tracks can easily lead any producer to become risk averse. So whether you're an expert or just starting out, make sure you use some of your production time screwing around and doing things that you haven't seen done before. I'm going to be making more videos in this theoretical style where I actually write a script and don't focus so heavily on production techniques. I already have the next 2 planned, and they're gonna be on topics I haven't seen covered before, so keep an eye out for that. If this is your first video of mine that you've seen, I also do tutorials where I actually get into the nitty-gritty of how to produce, so go check those out too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.